encouraged by the turnout here in the circle, and I want to acknowledge that I am here with people who are a little bit older than me and have more experience and probably some more wisdom on this topic of reconciliation. So I say this with sincerity. I anticipate hearing your insights and hope what I can toss out here is of benefit. And I also just want to reaffirm that we are gathered really in sacred space, that this is covenanted land, this Treaty 1 territory that we're in. Back in 1871, through prayer and pipe and ceremony, this place was, we committed, our relations committed to live in radical mutuality, at least in word, that was shared. So I think that old story that happened back at the old stone fort has a lot to tell us today about what reconciliation means. So what does it mean? Here's a few thoughts. The word, as we know, is a popular one. Over the past 25 years, with all the apologies that churches and governments have made to Indigenous peoples, particularly around residential schools, but also having to do with the Columbus quincentenary back in 1992, and recently we have a lot of United Church folk here, so we know the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery has happened as well. There have been lots of sorries and plenty of commitments towards the work of reconciliation. And over the last 5 years, the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has brought even greater mainstream attention to this word through its powerful work of exposing and documenting what is a really little-known aspect of one piece of the colonial story here in Canada. Still only 50% of Canadians know about residential schools. The word is so popular now, some would say fashionable, that on the west coast in the unceded and contested Indigenous lands, which some call British Columbia, the provincial government there decided not long ago to rename their Aboriginal Affairs Ministry as the Ministry of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation. But what does it mean? And who gets to define what reconciliation means? And who doesn't get the power and the privilege to do so? Of course, reconciliation, like the word treaty, has something to do with making peace and friendship. It's a huge, weighty word that is often, to the advantage of many, left very fuzzy and without definition. It comes with plenty of good intentions, and understandably, many who have darker complexions than me are wary of this term. People like Diagi Alfred, the Mohawk scholar, who says this: reconciliation buttresses white supremacy. Reconciliation pacifies Indigenous leaders. Reconciliation facilitates total access to our lands for resource extraction. Whoa. That's not a very happy appraisal of reconciliation. And I think most Canadians, most of us, believe that reconciliation is a good thing. So why does Diagi and many others say that? A friend of mine, Jennifer Harvey, shared a story with me not long ago that might offer some insight. Several years ago, she says, I was part of an email exchange between Tink Tinker, a Native American, and a white colleague, discussing the apology that Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, gave to the Aboriginal peoples. My colleague expressed how pleased he was with it, and initially I was pleased too. The apology lamented the egregious oppression Australian policy had visited upon host peoples. Like Canada, Australia's policy, their colonial history, is constituted by massive land dispossession and genocide in a variety of forms. So an apology seemed long overdue. But then Tinker weighed in with an email saying that Indigenous peoples should reject any apology that comes without transfers of land. This good, the apology, was worse than meaningless. While it posed as a moral recalibration, it did not alter the material realities of Aboriginal communities, and it didn't shift existing power relations. In time, says my friend Jennifer, I came to agree with Tinker. It's a deeply flawed assumption in the dominant society that we can seek some form of reconciliation without redressing and concretely responding to the actual damage for which one was apologizing. So this good apology wasn't all that good. This expression of reconciliation was dangerous. Now, I don't think reconciliation comes in one shape or size. And I think the journey towards true peace and friendship can and often is incremental. We all know that from personal relationships that have been fractured and struggle over time to find healing step by step. I speak as a married man who, like, with all sincerity, the struggles to do that. But that said, I too, like Diagi and Tinker, find the talk of reconciliation that churches and governments most often take up deeply disturbing. And I say that from within the institution. There's lots of words about regret for past forms of paternalism and assimilation, which is good. There are plenty of sincere expressions articulating a desire for a renewed relationship. And sometimes we boldly even say we want to honor things like recognize the rights, Aboriginal treaty rights of the people. But there isn't, broadly speaking, the concrete, costly action to back up that lofty rhetoric. Action that can repair the foundations of these relationships. And we all know that those foundations, more often than not, have something to do with land. As Thomas King says in that great recent book of his, Inconvenient Indian, if you understand nothing else about the history of Indians in North America, you need to understand that the question that really matters is the question of land. And for sure, there are pockets of settler peoples and settler conscience that are seeking to address that question. We think of Kairos, or Christian peacemaker teams, or some of the settlers in our neighborhood who have allied with I don't know more. But these are in the extreme minority, even within the church. The vast majority understand reconciliation to be regret for past wrongdoing and a desire for renewed relationships in the present, but relationships largely on our terms. Is that reconciliation? So I'm going to be bold enough to say what I think reconciliation might mean to some of my Indigenous friends and neighbors. If reconciliation is defined more by Indigenous communities across this land, rather than the church and government and settler society, then I don't think the primary focus would be on relationship building. I, for example, don't get many Jewish neighbors coming to me and saying, all I want is a relationship with the Mennonite church. Because they're doing socioeconomically, they're doing okay. If it's not on relationship building, where is it? I think the focus would be on a radical redistribution or rejurisdiction of power, of land, and of wealth. In other words, it would sound a lot like the subversive message announced by an old friend of ours, Jesus. Watch out, rich. The time has come. Creator's reign has drawn near, and she's allied with the poor. Luke 4, Luke 6. And that kind of reconciliation, if practiced by Indigenous and settler peoples, would look a lot like the story of Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus, found in Luke 19. And I'll offer this up and I'll finish with this. Jesus was passing through Jericho. A man was there named Zach. He was a chief tax collector and well off. He had heard about Jesus, wanted to see who he was, so he ran ahead of the crowds. When Jesus was walking by, he said to Zach, "Get over here, bro. I'm going to stay with you today." Zach was blown away. He was overwhelmed that this man would welcome him. All who saw it, however, began to grumble and said, "Jesus has gone to be the guest of one who's a sinner, a collaborator." But Zach immediately said to Jesus, "Look, half of my possessions, I'm going to give them away to the poor. 4 times as much, I'm going to pay back those I've cheated." Then Jesus said, and this is so radical, "Friend, salvation peace has come to your house this day. Do we see the kind of reconciliation that's being worked out here? Just imagine that Jesus is an indigenous rebel rouser, which he was. He's like a Sylvia McAdam, one of, I don't know, Moore's founders. And Zach is, let's make him a Mennonite from Steinbach. You United Church folk can take on some mantle of yourself. But I'll make him, he's a Mennonite from Steinbach who has privilege and power in large part because this is a true story. Back in 1874, the Cree Métis people, their land was dispossessed and Mennonites were given a West Reserve. Having encountered Sylvia's radical message and radical welcome, she's going to the guy who's in that place of privilege. The Mennonite says, half of my possessions, I'm going to find a way to give back to the dispossessed, and 4 times as much to those who have been cheated by my ancestors. Now that's a reconciliation I think might mean something to many Indigenous peoples. A reconciliation that will alter material realities beyond words. A reconciliation that will honor the treaty that we live here with. A reconciliation that is just and might even save. Might save.